So let's recap what we did yesterday and last week. And unfortunately, I forgot to check my notes. what we even covered last week. Oh gosh, that's dumb. Why did I wait until now to think about that? All right, so we've been talking about separation of powers. I know that. I don't remember exactly what the arguments were from the last shoot. That's really bad. That's a bad look. Everybody's gonna unsubscribe now. Hold on. So Blue Arena, when does John Jay come back? He comes back for a single essay when we're talking about the Senate. He's around 62 or something, around that point, and he does one essay. That's when we get him again. TYZJ, I decided to go on an early medieval temple. Oh, nice. That's nice. Yeah, TYZJ is in Japan right now. So if it's early medieval, maybe you're in Nara or that area. Last week, Madison told us why legislatures were dangerous. Oh, yeah, we were talking about the state legislatures and how crazy some of them got in the post-revolutionary period. Oh, yeah, he critiqued... Did he critique Jefferson? He talked about Jefferson. I know he does it a couple different points. Yeah, I think he did talk about Jefferson's... oh gosh, I'm gonna get all my weeks mixed up. Which when he talked about the what Jefferson said. Oh, was it last week Jefferson talked about, or is it this week? Do you need to have a revolution every 20 years? I feel like that was not last week. I can't remember. Perfect separation of powers is impossible. Oh yes, that's right. Thank you. Thank goodness you folks are here. I would have no idea what we covered. Yes, one of the points he addressed was that a major anti-federalist criticism was that the proposed constitution had some interactions between the branches of the government, the legislative, executive, and judicial, and Madison argued that actually you need to have that. If you don't have that, it makes it more likely that one of the branches is going to become tyrannical. The weird committee executive in Pittsburgh. Oh, yeah, the Council of Censors. Right. He talked about the Council of Censors. He's going to talk about it again tonight. Yes, he is. In 50, in number 50, he talks about them again. Okay, wow. Yeah. Good save. Now nobody will know that I did not go back and check. Okay, tonight he's continuing the theme. He has 3 more essays talking about separation of powers. And separation of powers, again, to define it, means so instead of having a government where you have a single power, either an individual like a monarch or a dictator, or a group of people like an oligarchy, a group of people who just controls everything, or you just have a legislative body, but that's the only governing body. In all of those cases, the theory goes... This is the theory that goes back to like John Locke and Montesquieu. The theory was, if you have any kind of institution like that, it's going to end up being tyrannical. There's nothing to stop them from doing whatever they want. And you can have that in that's kind of obvious with a monarch or with a dictator. You can also have that, the argument went, with a legislature, because you can have a kind of like majority rules type of thing where a majority of the legislature decides they're just going to do whatever, and they're going to tread on the rights of other individuals in the society. You could have like tyranny of the majority against the minority kind of thing. So the solution is to have a separation of powers where you have different branches of government that have different responsibilities, and the different responsibilities are carried out by different individuals. And you can't have, so like the people who make the laws are not also the people who adjudicate them or execute them. The people who execute the laws and see that they're enforced are not the same people who are making the laws, that kind of thing. You have a separation of powers. But then, like I said, in the proposed constitution that came out of Philadelphia, which was later ratified and adopted, there are 3 different branches that have separate responsibilities, but they interact with each other in various ways. So, for example, the vice president, who is an official in the executive branch, vice president, also presides over the Senate. In fact, that's pretty much his only constitutional role, is to preside over the Senate. The Senate being, of course, a legislative body. In treaties, the president makes treaties, but then the treaties have to be ratified by the Senate, so legislative oversight, that kind of thing. So, and the members of the judiciary are appointed by the president, and then those appointments, oh gosh, are approved. I believe this is in the Constitution that Congress approves them. I'd have to go back and look, or I don't know if that's just statute that they do that. Okay, so we're doing separation of powers, and so he's that, and there are 3 essays we're looking at tonight. The third one is a really famous one. Number 51 is one of the most famous of the Federalist Papers. So that'll be interesting, where he talks about how, I guess, I don't know how to sum it up, his kind of, how his way of handling, like, separation of powers, how to make it work. So we'll see what he says about that. All right, so let's start with 49. The author of the Notes on the State of Virginia, quoted in the last paper, so that's Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson wrote his most famous work. Well, actually, what am I saying? His most famous work is the Declaration of Independence. But I guess the work that he wrote at the time that made him the most famous was Notes on the State of Virginia. And at the end of that book, he included as an appendix his draft for a proposed constitution for Virginia, which was never adopted. And that's what he's going to reference here in this essay. So the author of the Notes on the State of Virginia, quoted in the last paper, has subjoined to that valuable work the draft of a constitution, which had been prepared in order to be laid before a convention expected to be called in 1783 by the legislature for the establishment of a constitution for that commonwealth. The plan, like everything, the Commonwealth, of course, referencing Virginia, because Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia call themselves commonwealths. The other states call themselves states. And then later on, Kentucky became a state and also calls itself commonwealth. So there are 4 states that use the term commonwealth for themselves. The plan, meaning Jefferson's proposed constitution for Virginia, the plan, like everything from the same pen, marks a turn of thinking original, comprehensive, and accurate, and is the more worthy of attention as it equally displays a fervent attachment to republican government and an enlightened view of the dangerous propensities against which it ought to be guarded. One of the precautions which he proposes, and on which he appears ultimately to rely as a palladium to the weaker departments of power, against the invasions of the stronger, is perhaps altogether his own, and as it immediately relates to the subject of our present inquiry, ought not to be overlooked. His proposition is that whenever any 2 of the 3 branches of government shall concur in opinion, each by the voices of 2/3 of their whole number, that a convention is necessary for altering the Constitution or correcting breaches of it, a convention shall be called for the purpose. As the people are the only legitimate fountain of power, and it is from them that the constitutional charter under which the several branches of government hold their power is derived, it seems strictly consonant to the Republican theory to recur to the same original authority not only whenever it may be necessary to enlarge, diminish, or new model the powers of government, but also whenever any one of the departments may commit encroachments on the chartered authorities of the others. The several departments being perfectly coordinate by the terms of their common commission, neither of them, it is evident, can pretend to an exclusive or superior right of settling the boundaries between their respective powers, and how are the encroachments of the stronger to be prevented, or the wrongs of the weaker to be redressed, without an appeal to the people themselves, who, as the grantors of the commission, can alone declare in truth meaning and enforce its observance. So first he quotes from Jefferson's proposed constitution, which says that anytime the Constitution is going to be revised or changed, the mechanism for doing that is for 2 of the 3 branches of government to call for a new constitutional convention. And then they would have, in the different districts across the state, they would elect delegates to a constitutional convention. That constitutional convention would meet, and then they would either make amendments to the Constitution or they would draft a new constitution. Oh, and I referenced this earlier. I guess I didn't mention this last week, but That was Jefferson's attitude about constitutional. His attitude about constitutions was constitutions are for the living, not for the dead. There's no point in people necessarily maintaining a constitution that was written by people who are now dead. Every new generation should be free to create a new constitution for themselves. So he figured about every 20 years or so, there could be a new constitutional convention, and people would draft a whole new constitution for themselves. That was Jefferson's thinking. Of course, most of the founding fathers didn't feel that way. That's why he didn't set it up that way. But that was Jefferson's thinking, and that's certainly reflected here, where he's like, well, we'll just have the branches of government call for a new constitutional convention, and they'll make a new constitution. And then in the following paragraph, Madison kind of like explains Jefferson's thinking, kind of like steelmans it, to use that common term nowadays. Like he says, well, yeah, I mean, all three branches of government are based on the people. That's where their authority comes from. So yeah, it makes sense. It's not like one branch can tell another branch whatever. Like, like it just goes back, if there's an issue with the Constitution, it can revert back to the people. Now, this is Madison is mentioning this in the context of how do you prevent one of the branches of the three branches of government from becoming tyrannical. And so the idea here is that in Jefferson's system, that the other two, so one of the branches is becoming tyrannical, is becoming dictator and consolidating power onto itself. Then the other two branches would see that happening and would be alarmed, and then they would call a constitutional convention, and then the Constitution would be revised to correct whatever issue it was that was allowing that branch from getting too powerful. So that's the context for this. So Madison continues, there is certainly great force in this reasoning, and it must be allowed to prove that a constitutional road to the decision of the people ought to be marked out and kept open for certain great and extraordinary occasions. But there appear to be insuperable objections against the proposed recurrence to the people, as a provision in all cases for keeping the several departments of power within their constitutional limits. Madison says, yeah, I mean, it sounds great, but there are problems, and so he's going to talk about the problems. In the first place, the provision does not reach the case of a combination of two of the departments against a third. So, in other words, like, how do you deal with a situation where two of the branches of government are conspiring to consolidate power among themselves, and the third branch realizes there's a problem, but the third branch can't call a convention by itself? If the legislative authority, which possesses so many means of operating on the motives of the other departments, should be able to gain to its interest either of the others, or even 1/3 of its members, the remaining department could derive no advantage from this remedial provision. I do not dwell, however, on this objection, because it may be thought to lie rather against the modification of the principle than against the principle itself. So he's saying here, the legislative authority has in other words, the legislature would have such an ability to influence the other two branches that it could prevent one of the other branches from calling a constitutional convention. Because as Jefferson wrote it, at least it has to be 2/3 of that branch. So in the case of a legislature becoming too powerful, be 2/3 of the executive branch and 2/3 of the judicial branch. I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and look at his draft to see. I think he only had one. Oh, I don't know. I've looked at several different state constitutions from that time recently, and I think I'm going to mix them up. But yeah, anyway, 2/3 of the executive branch and 2/3 of the judicial branch. But as long as the legislature can persuade through whatever means 1/3 of each of those branches from not opposing its scheme, then it wouldn't work. In the next place, it may be considered as an objection inherent in the principle that as every appeal to the people would carry an implication of some defect in the government, frequent appeals would, in a great measure, deprive the government of that veneration which time bestows on everything, and without which perhaps the wisest and freest governments would not possess the requisite stability. If it be true that all governments rest on opinion, it is no less true that the strength of opinion in each individual, and its practical influence on his conduct, depend much on the number which he supposes to have entertained the same opinion. The reason of man, like man himself, is timid and cautious when left alone, and acquires firmness and confidence in proportion to the number with which he is associated. When the examples which fortify opinion are ancient as well as numerous, they are known to have a double effect. In a nation of philosophers, this consideration ought to be disregarded. A reverence for the laws would be sufficiently inculcated by the voice of an enlightened reason. But a nation of philosophers is as little to be expected as the philosophical race of kings wished for by Plato. And in every other nation, the most rational government will not find it a superfluous advantage to have the prejudices of the community on its side. So in this paragraph, he offers another reason why Jefferson's idea wouldn't work, and that's that if you have an old constitution, the oldness of it lends itself to the stability of the system, because many of the people would simply respect the fact that it's old and grant the oldness, the venerability of that document, an authority, that it would rise in authority in many people's eyes because of that. And he's appealing to human nature. He says if you had some like hypothetical country full of rational philosophers, you wouldn't need to rely on venerability. And I feel like, Madison and Jefferson were close friends, but I feel like this gets at an issue, at least it gets at an issue that I have with Jefferson. I don't know if Madison had this, but Jefferson kind of imagined that that's what the Republic was going to be, just a bunch of yeoman philosophers. And whereas Madison is like, well, real human nature, venerability, and the point here, I guess I skipped. The point is, it doesn't matter how old the Constitution is. If all you care about is how reasonable it is, that's what they're going to go for, is how reasonable is it? That's what a philosopher would say. But you have to deal with the nature of normal people. That's how, you got to deal with like the way they think. So and he has some interesting observations about majorities and about how people feel much more confident in their opinions if they know a lot of other people around them share those opinions. And so if anyway. TYZJ, it's interesting because Plato's Republic is really a super bad theocracy. Even want to ban Homer's works. Well, you're saying that like that's a bad idea. I'm just joking. Blue Harino, interesting thinking about how Jefferson thought of a fluid constitution compared to the block of people who treat the words. Oh yeah, absolutely. Treat the words of the Constitution as a sacred text that must be interpreted literally and in the sense of the time they wrote it. Yeah, that's. Jefferson for sure. This doesn't necessarily reflect anybody else in his generation, but Jefferson himself could not care less about how old a document was or what the document said. If he were here today, he'd be like, who cares? He would not be a strict constructionist for sure. He would. I don't know. I don't know for sure how he'd feel about the judiciary, or what I forget what the term is when you like the opposite of strict constructionist. But in principle, he wouldn't be opposed to it. UIZJ, because he thinks Homer made, perfect God's done a bunch of bad things. Oh, yeah. And there'd probably be a bad influence on the people. Yeah, I could see that. I have a hazy memory of an experiment in which people went door to door with the text of the First Amendment claiming it was a proposed amendment. And a substantial majority thought it should not be a new amendment. That's funny. That'd be hilarious. If we can get some confirmation on that, that'd be hilarious. Maybe I might be able to find some way to work that into a video someday. Okay. So, resuming. The danger of disturbing the public tranquility by interesting too strongly the public passions is a still more serious objection against a frequent reference of constitutional questions to the decision of the whole society. Notwithstanding the success which has attended the revisions of our established forms of government, and which does so much honor to the virtue and intelligence of the people of America, it must be confessed that the experiments are of too ticklish a nature to be unnecessarily multiplied. We are to recollect that all the existing constitutions were formed in the midst of a danger which repressed the passions most unfriendly to order and concord, of an enthusiastic confidence of the people in their patriotic leaders, which stifled the ordinary diversity of opinions on great national questions, of an universal ardor for new and opposite forms produced by an universal resentment and indignation against the ancient government, and whilst no spirit of party connected with the changes to be made, or the abuses to be reformed, could mingle its leaven in the operation, the future situations in which we must expect to be usually placed do not present any equivalent security against the danger which is apprehended. That's pretty self-explanatory. He just says that, I mean, I don't want to misquote him here. Yeah, so he said, notwithstanding the success which has attended the revisions of our established forms of government. He notes, so he's referencing the state constitutions that came out of the revolutionary period of the 1770s, 1776 through the end of that decade. And he said, notwithstanding that they're good documents and the people who made them are very smart, there's a lot of crazy stuff in there, because they were so eager to change from what had been before. And in some cases, they got real experimental. So that's basically what he's saying there. And I would take it to mean, I hope I'm not misreading him or reading too much into him, but I would take it to mean that you could have situations in the future where you have some fad, like ANCAP, for example. You have some fad going on in the political sphere, and there's some, like, crisis going on politically, and then people just create some, partially unworkable system as a result. But the greatest objection of all is that the decisions which would probably result from such appeals would not answer the purpose of maintaining the constitutional equilibrium of the government. It would actually defeat its own purpose. We have seen that the tendency of republican governments is to an aggrandizement of the legislative at the expense of the other departments. The appeals to the people, therefore, would usually be made by the executive and judiciary departments. But whether made by one side or the other, would each side enjoy equal advantages on the trial? Let us view their different situations. The members of the executive and judiciary departments are few in number, and can be personally known to a small part only of the people. The latter, by the mode of their appointment, as well as by the nature and permanency of it, are too far removed from the people to share much in their prepossessions. The former, the legislature, are generally the objects of jealousy, and their administration is always liable to be discolored and rendered unpopular. Well, okay, maybe I misread what the former is. Hold on, the executive. So the judiciary, through the mode of its appointment, as well as the nature and permanency of it, are too far removed from the people to share much in their prepossessions. The executive are generally the objects of jealousy, and their administration is always liable to be discolored and rendered unpopular. The members of the legislative department, on the other hand, are numerous. They are distributed and dwell among the people at large. Their connections of blood, of friendship, and of acquaintance embrace a great proportion of the most influential part of the society. The nature of their public trust implies a personal weight with the people, and that they are more immediately the confidential guardians of their rights and liberties. With these advantages, it can hardly be supposed that the adverse party would have an equal chance for a favorable issue. So, to sum up, it's most likely the case if you have a situation where a constitutional convention is called, most likely it would be the legislature who's out of line, and the executive and the judicial branches would call the convention. However, due to the nature of the three branches, the legislature will always have a big influence on how the convention plays out, because they're closer to the people are more familiar with them, the people will feel a closer connection with the members of the legislature. The executive, people will be a little bit suspicious of it because of the nature of that office. The judiciary, they'll be a little bit removed from that. They won't really know much about the members of the judiciary. So the people and the members of the Constitutional Convention will be natural allies of whatever the legislature is trying to do. Only the House of Representatives were actually known and integrated with their community. Yeah, right. I mean, back then this was pretty accurate, but today, like, you have one. Today, is the size of the House of Representatives was locked in the 1920s at 435. And the U.S. population has increased, like, what, fourfold since then? I don't know. So now we have, or maybe threefold. Now we have one representative for every million citizens, roughly 800,000 or something. I don't remember what the exact thing is on average. Most people can't name the representative. Most people can name the president. Most people, actually, probably more people can name some of the members of the Supreme Court than can name the member of the House of Representatives from their own district. That's off the top of my head. I don't know, but I suspect that's the case. He's right. I'm not friends with any Supreme Court justices on Facebook. Are you friends with your representative on Facebook, though? That's the important question. Anyway, where was I? I think I'm here. No, I'm down here. But the legislative party would not only be able to plead their cause most successfully with the people, they would probably be constituted themselves the judges. The same influence which had gained them an election into the legislature would gain them a seat in the convention. If this should not be the case with all, it would probably be the case with many, and pretty certainly with those leading characters on whom everything depends in such bodies. The convention, in short, would be composed chiefly of men who had been, who actually were, or who expected to be, members of the department whose conduct was arraigned. The legislature, in other words. They would consequently be parties to the very question to be decided by them. F. Conagratz knows where the local office is. Well, that's good. That's good that you know where the local office is. Blue Jay was the framework for the executive branch under the assumption that America would remain largely isolationist. Washington wanted to avoid foreign affairs in Europe. I wonder what the founders would think of the War Powers Act, especially considering Congress hasn't formally declared war since World War II. Well, I certainly think the War Powers Act, they would probably take exception to, because they would probably feel like that's more of a concentration of power in the executive than they had planned on. I mean, the presidency in general is much more powerful than it was in practice back in the 19th century. I guess I don't know yet. That's research I'm going to be embarking on soon, but I don't know yet exactly what they had in mind at the convention for presidential power. But yeah. So I think your question was mainly about the War Powers Act. In general, well, Washington, when Washington said no entanglement with foreign alliances, he was speaking, I don't know if he felt that way in general. He was being specific when he said that. I'm actually going to be touching on this when I do my 1796 election video, which I've kept putting on the back burner because of other stuff, but I am eventually going to get to that. And I will be discussing his farewell address in there. But he was speaking specifically about the Revolutionary Wars. He hated the partisanship that was emerging in American politics, and that was very much tied in with the revolutionary stuff going on in France. The political polarization was in the U.S. was kind of aligned with the polarization in France. And so he was a Federalist. And I know people say he was independent, but he was a Federalist. And he didn't like the French Revolution, and he didn't like the fact that the Republicans at the time, which of course are not the same as the modern Republicans, he didn't like that they were pro-revolution, pro-French Revolution, what was the name? Not the Directory. What was the name of that regime under Robespierre? Anyway, the Republicans were sympathetic to the revolutionary regime in France. Anyway, so that was his issue. So in a different context, in a post-World War II world, would he have a problem with the U.S. Being involved with foreign alliances? I wouldn't necessarily say no. I mean, I don't think that's necessarily the case. EYZJ, Jefferson did argue if France want to make an empire in North America again, he want to become friend of British Navy. Even yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, as much as Jefferson was a Francophile, he loved French culture, he loved everything about France, and he loved the Revolution. He was not about to have them presenting a this national security threat to the U.S. in North America. Oh, so not completely isolationist, sure. I mean, so Washington's position was stop trying to get involved with what was going on over there. A lot of other people at the time were like, let's take sides. You know, they were trying to take sides. Jefferson was trying to take sides. That was what Washington was getting at with the farewell address, was like, guys, you need to stop trying to take sides. So yeah, the other people in the 1790s were not necessarily isolationists. Many of them were not. Blue Harino, do you still independent research, not affiliated through? That's right. Yeah, I do all this on my own. I get to do whatever research I want. My bailiwick when I was teaching was technically world history. Like that was my official kind of area. But there was somebody else who did U.S. history. I didn't, so therefore U.S. history was out of bounds. I was never going to teach anything about U.S. history because that would be kind of silly. Why hire me to do this one thing and then I'm going to go teach something that somebody else can already, you know? So, but yeah, so now with a YouTube channel, I can do U.S. history whenever I want. Blue Jay, I know on paper the president is supposed to be our foreign affairs guy, but at the time America's growth was a fraction of what it is now. Yep, and that was a big problem. Washington, I think, was right that the U.S. was way too weak to be wading into that. Not that it had a choice; it was going to be dragged in no matter what, and obviously it was dragged in. But yeah. Oh no, the directorate was later. I was talking about Robespierre. How do you sneak into archives without a library card? Oh, you get a library card. What you do. Public can get a library card. You don't have to have an affiliation. You might have to pay a nominal fee, but the one big problem with not being affiliated with the university is not having access to online databases. All the, there's so much stuff that's online that you log into with a university login that if you don't have that university affiliation, you just have no access to. The Committee of Public Safety, yeah, that's what I was trying to think of. I thought there was a name for the regime, though, that period, because they were in charge. Maybe that's all it is. Maybe it's just called the Committee of Public Safety. Let's see if we can just find a quick. Yeah, it's just called First Republic, I guess. Yeah, First Republic, I guess, was what I was trying. Yeah, because it was a monarchy. It was a constitutional monarchy, and then they deposed the king and created the First Republic, and then in 1795 they switched to the Directory. So yeah, the First Republic was what I was trying to think of. Or you've just heard it called Convention. Yeah, that could be. Yeah. But yeah, that's so in terms of timeline that they overlap. So the period of the terror overlaps with Washington's second term. That was what was going on in foreign policy, foreign affairs, when Washington was doing a second term. Yeah, right. You never. I probably shouldn't admit to the institutional access I'm sitting on and not using. That's the thing. You never appreciate it until you don't have it. You sit there, you've got it, and you don't go in there. So you should go in there. You should read stuff every day. Just find some random article or book chapter and just start reading it. You got to use that access while you've got it. Okay. Oh gosh, I have no memory of where I was. I think I must be here. Yeah, I think that's where I am. Okay. It might, however, sometimes happen, Madison continues, that appeals would be made under circumstances less adverse to the executive and judiciary departments. The usurpations of the legislature might be so flagrant and so sudden as to admit of no specious coloring. A strong party among themselves might take side with the other branches. The executive power might be in the hands of a peculiar favorite of the people. In such a posture of things, the public decision might be less swayed by prepossessions in favor of the legislative party. But still, it could never be expected to turn on the true merits of the question. It would inevitably be connected with the spirit of parties pre-existing, or springing out of the question itself. It would be connected with persons of distinguished character and extensive influence in the community. It would be pronounced by the very men who had been agents in or opponents of the measures to which the decision would relate. The passions, therefore, not the reason, of the public would sit in judgment. But it is the reason of the public alone that ought to control and regulate the government. The passions ought to be controlled and regulated by the government. We found in the last, so in other words, even if you had a situation, so, in the previous paragraph he had said, well, most likely, if you have a situation where the Jefferson's proposed Virginia system, most of the time when there's a problem with the Constitution, it'll be the legislature going out of bounds, acting up. The two other branches would try to stop them. But because of the close affinity between the legislature and the people would naturally side with the legislature, whatever they're doing. Members of the legislature would likely be elected to whatever constitutional convention was called, so it would be pointless. And then he says in this paragraph, even if, so like putting that scenario aside, you could have situations where not everybody in the legislature is on board with what the legislature is trying to do, and they form an alliance with the other branches, or maybe the executive branch, the governor is very popular with the people. He's kind of a demagogue. He might be able to draw people to himself. I guess demagogue is not the right word, but, like very popular. You could have a situation where you don't just have the legislature dominating the Constitutional Convention. Even then, the public decision would happen. The public, like the Constitutional Convention, would be acting in accordance with passions, with emotions, to use it modern language, would be acting according to emotions, not according to reason. Nobody tell Madison that the public reputation of members of Congress is just slightly worse than that of career criminals. Yeah, it's different today than it used to be. Ujay, technically Madison was also a treasonous person. He just happened. Yeah, well, let's not get into the... You're being too technical about that. Yeah, all these people are traitors. Absolutely. Yep, that's true. So, anyway, we found in the last paper, Madison says, that mere declarations in the written Constitution are not sufficient to restrain the several departments within their legal limits. It appears in this that occasional appeals to the people would neither a proper nor an effectual provision for that purpose. How far the provisions of a different nature contained in the plan above quoted might be adequate, I do not examine. Some of them are unquestionably founded on sound political principles, and all of them are framed with singular ingenuity and precision. Publius. How come the U.S. was so inspired by the ancient Romans, but the Spanish colonies not? Were they not? I'm not sure about that. I think they were. Epiconograph, they haven't rebelled in over a decade. Yeah. Why does Madison leave so much space on the pages like this? This is not the original. So the original was published in newspapers, and kind of like an ongoing series over a period of several months. And then they were gathered together and published in book form. Actually, not even all the essays had appeared at the point that the book first edition of the Federalist Papers compiled together appeared in May, I believe, of 1788. And this edition is from 14 years later. It's a later printing from 1802. So the way the printer did it is that he just starts every new one on the top of the next page. Okay, so we're going to start number 50. And number 50, so number 49 was talking about Jefferson's solution to the problem of how do you prevent one of, like, if you have a separation of powers, the big danger with the separation of powers is that one of the branches is going to become dictatorial. How do you prevent that from happening? In 49, he looked at Jefferson's solution and explained why he thinks it wouldn't work. And then in 50, he's going to look at another solution from Pennsylvania. Show well how much paper you can afford to waste. Yeah. I wonder how many people actually read these. Quite a few people read them at the time. Everyone who was politically engaged, everyone who was capable of obviously, if you, I'm sure there were a lot of people who were like reading or following things who did not themselves have the right to vote, but certainly those people who had the right to vote and who were involved, were in a position to express their opinion on these matters through voting for legislators or voting for convention delegates. Yeah, I think most of them were reading this stuff. Everyone who was politically engaged was reading this. This was right before New York called its convention. I don't remember exactly the date was when New York called its constitutional convention in, I think it was Poughkeepsie, to decide whether they're going to ratify the convention, the Philadelphia Convention, Constitution, ratify the Philadelphia Constitution. So like people were either gearing up to elect delegates to that convention. So anybody who was interested in the topic, they were certainly reading stuff like this and other stuff too, written by other people who had other opinions about these matters. What was the circulation of the New York Packet? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know the circulation numbers for any of the papers that were. It was February 1780. What else was there to do but churn butter and read Federalist papers, right? It's not like they were going to watch Twitch. I mean, there's plenty of stuff for them to do besides read, but certainly, well, I mean, there's less to do in February than there is in the summer, but yeah, people read all the time. People, I guess not, some people are more readers than others, but back then reading was much more, you had fewer options, you were like there wasn't the option to watch TV. There wasn't the option, there were other things that we can do now they didn't have the option to do. So in order to accomplish that same thing, that entertainment or whatever, you would use text to do it. Or you'd have, there were other things too. There were like plays and stuff, but people used books and pamphlets and newspapers and magazines to fill a lot of the niches of their daily life in ways that other media do today. Have you ever been to Rochester in February? There's nothing to do in the 21st century. Yep, that's right. And Rochester in the 21st century has more going on than New York in the 18th century did. That would be hilarious. Bluerino. I should totally do that. So where do you get Subway Surfer footage? That's what I always wonder. Like, where's all this? Like, do they have to play it and then use that, or is there somewhere online you can just get stock Subway Surfer footage you can put on your TikTok video? But I should do that. It'd be hilarious. Nobody would watch it. It would bomb as a short or as a TikTok. But the principle of it is pretty funny. Okay, so number 50. It's this random Grand Theft Auto gameplay of people not knowing how to drive in game. Well, that would be me. I have no idea how to drive in game. Yeah, I should do that. I should do Grand Theft Auto. I was gonna say maybe I could do RDR, but Red Dead Redemption. That would be like more thematic. And I thought, no, actually, it'd be funnier if it's Grand Theft Auto. Oh, you would. Yeah, I bet it's a lot of the same clip, and people don't. Yeah, I bet that's true because it all looks the same. Subway Subway. Am I saying that right? Subway Surfer. Yeah. Okay, Wino. I think, yeah, I'll take your word for it. I don't know. Maybe I should try it. I'm gonna try it. If I can ever, I hate to take time away from trying to get a video ready, but the idea is so funny. I want to try it. So maybe I'll buy GTA and Let me see. How much does GTA cost? Let me just check real quick. Uh, I assume Subway Surfer is not on Steam. Oh, $20, man. But for sure, I would be terrible at it. So yeah, the bad driving would be perfect because I have not once played GTA in my life. In fact, that would probably make a good stream. I open it up for the first time and try to do it. All right. So let's start number 50. It may be contended, perhaps, that instead of occasional appeals to the people, which are liable to the objections urged against them, periodical appeals are the proper and adequate means of preventing and correcting infractions of the Constitution. It will be attended to that in the examination of these expedients, I confine myself to their aptitude for enforcing the Constitution by keeping the several departments of power within their due bounds, without particularly considering them as provisions for altering the Constitution itself. In the first view, appeals to the people at fixed periods appear to be nearly as ineligible as appeals on particular occasions as they emerge. If the periods be separated by short intervals, the measures to be reviewed and rectified will have been of recent date, and will be connected with all the circumstances which tend to vitiate and pervert the result of occasional revisions. If the periods be distant from each other, the same remark will be applicable to all recent measures. And in proportion as the remoteness of the others may favor a dispassionate review of them, this advantage is inseparable from inconveniences which seem to counterbalance it. In the first place, a distant prospect of public censure would be a very feeble restraint on power from those excesses to which it might be urged by the force of present motives. Is it to be imagined that a legislative assembly consisting of 100 or 200 members, eagerly bent on some favorite object and breaking through the restraints of the Constitution in pursuit of it, would be arrested in their career by considerations drawn from a censorial revision of their conduct at the future distance of 10, 15, or 20 years? In the next place, the abuses would often have completed their mischievous effects before the remedial provision would be applied. And in the last place, where this might not be the case, they would be of long standing, would have taken deep root, and would not easily be extirpated. So, in this essay, he's addressing, because in 49, he said, what if a convention could be called whenever two of the branches felt like it was necessary to call it a convention, constitutional convention. So that's being like an ad hoc, occasional basis. Now he's saying, okay, well, what if the solution is not to have it an ad hoc, occasional basis that has to be specifically called by two branches of government? What if you make it a regular thing, like every 5 years, every 15 years, something like that? The Constitutional Convention is automatically called. It automatically happens, and people have to vote for delegates, and then they meet, and then they make whatever changes need to be made. So he says in this paragraph that wouldn't work either, because either the intervals between the Constitutional Conventions would be so short that people wouldn't even know what the effects are of the changes that they had made by the time they come back again for the next convention, or you make the gaps too wide, and then anybody who oversteps bounds and starts taking advantage of loopholes and starts making a mess of things, it'll be too long to wait, and they won't be stopped because because of how far away it is, or they'll make the changes and then it'll become established tradition by the time they get to the next convention or whatever. So that wouldn't work either, he's saying. I wonder how much of the increasing literacy rates in the past 2 centuries is due to the writing not sounding as much like this anymore. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I mean, literacy rates were pretty high back then. But I guess it depends on how you define literacy, right? Because certainly not everyone had the necessary education to read something like this. Okay, so I guess there are different ways of looking at this, and I don't know. I haven't actually researched. I know there's this whole body of research of people who just study like literacy, like they look at the history of literacy. So I'm kind of flying blind here by talking about this, but here are a few considerations. First of all, as I said a few minutes ago, text was much more prevalent in people's lives. Like printed text. I mean, obviously text is a big part of people's lives today, but it's texts, and Reddit comments and X, and stuff like that. It's a different kind of textual medium. But people like long form textual media were much more common, much more a part of people's daily lives back then. And if you have practice reading it, it becomes easier to read. Like you might have found this, for example, if you've like read English literature. The first time you start to read a Shakespeare play, it's really hard to understand. But the second time you try to read one, or the third time you try to read one, it's easier to understand, that kind of thing. Or the first time you try to read Dickens, it's kind of hard to follow, but like later on you read Dickens and it's a little bit easier because you just get practice reading it. But I think that's part of it. It's just people were used to that. But then the question is, why are they writing in such a convoluted way with all these long sentences and subordinate clauses and whatever? I don't know for sure, but I think it has to do with Latin education. Anytime you had, essentially at high school level education, you learned Latin. You learned to read Latin. And at this period, I don't know when this started. I don't know when this started in Latin education, but in this period, that a common way of doing, like a common thing you would do in your Latin class would be to translate back and forth between English and Latin. So that would mean that someone with a high school education would be used to constructing when they were writing stuff, which is not necessarily the same as when they're talking. It's not like people were walking around in the street talking like this, but when you're writing something down, you get in the habit of writing it in a way that you would write it in Latin. That's what I think is going on. And Latin education was much more common than it is now. And most people didn't get a high school education. Most people didn't go to college, or a high school equivalent education. But those who did would have had some familiarity with Latin. But it's a complex question about increasing literacy rates, because the issue with why literacy rates increased, I would say, is because of universal education. It's not necessarily the style. That's my own take on it, which is not founded on anything. It's not based on anything. That's just my speculation. But I would say that if we had universal education came in during the 19th century, mainly in the late 19th century, and then it became really universal in the early 20th century when child labor laws were instituted and were really like nationwide. There were different parts of the country. It happened at different times, but basically, child labor ceased to be a thing. Children were expected to be in school, and that became the norm. I think that's when you start seeing like really widespread, nearly universal education. And but then there was also a movement in the early 20th century to get away from Latin. It was called the modern language movement, I think. But it was a movement away from teaching Latin in schools and instead to teach modern languages like French and German and Spanish. And so you're not going to have as much of a Latin influence on people's style anymore. But again, that's just my take. I don't know for sure. So I'm a little bit behind on the chat. It's funny, Madison is agonizing over how to enforce the Constitution, and my first thought is, isn't that what the Supreme Court is for? Yes and no. Yes and no. Madison would, there'd be more discussion of this in the Federalist Papers as we go along. Madison would probably ask, what happens if the Supreme Court violates the Constitution? Oh, yeah. Oh, that's a good question. There might be, this might be the U.S. constitutional equivalent of the exhaust vent in the Death Star. I'm not sure. Okay, TYZJ. Supreme Court's power at the time is really vague. Yeah, a lot of the Supreme Court's role was kind of clarified over time. Once you've read Cicero, all these sentences seem short and simply constructed. Yep. You believe James Burke, universal literacy. Oh, yeah, another James Burke enjoyer. Universal literacy is a consequence of cheap artificial lighting. So that people who work all day can educate themselves at night. Yes. Like many things that he said, that might be an oversimplification, but his videos are still fun. James Burke had a big... I'm actually surprised there's somebody in chat who's heard of him, Because is he even still around? I don't know if he's still around. He had a huge influence on me when I was growing up. Probably one of the reasons I got into history as a topic. Science historian. This is the guy. Still alive. Great stuff. Got to take what he says with a grain of salt. Okay? Don't believe everything he says. He does oversimplify things. What is even his background? Is in science, not in history, right? Doesn't say. Studied Middle English. Okay. He got an MA in Middle English. He was a lecturer in Bologna in English and director of studies. Okay, so he is a humanities guy. Okay. Anyway, fun videos. He did this series on BBC called Connections. And then he did a bunch of stuff. Connections is really famous. Quite old now. But fun series if you like history. Again, take it with a grain of salt, though. But really awesome. Day the Universe Changed was on PBS in the late 80s. Awesome stuff. And then he did this really cool thing I've been wanting to go back and watch. After the Warming. Okay, they don't have a... They don't have a page for this one. After the Warming was on PBS. It's like him in 1989 looking into the future of what the world will be like. I don't remember how far in the future he went, like 2025 or 2050 or something, what the world will be like after the global warming that was going to happen. And like it would be so fun to go back and watch that now from the perspective of 2024. Yeah, The Day the Universe Changed. Such a good series. Double dunks. I'm not sure if he is a pop historian, but I will say that history generally only gains a broader appeal when it's pretty oversimplified, which I think is understandable. Yeah, and that's why I don't entirely object to James Burke and what he does, because it is a really great way of getting people interested in history. It got me interested in it. I mean, I may have been interested before that, but yeah. I mean, it's so cool the way he... The Day the Universe Changed is a lot like Connections. It's a really similar thing, where he'll just like take some modern thing, and then he'll like trace the history of how we got there in this really surprising unintuitive way. Like what was it Aficonograd said about artificial lighting? You get to universal lighting, universal literacy by way of artificial lighting. It's that kind of thing. Yeah, it's so good. All right. So we are right here. So here's where he gets into Pennsylvania and looks at the Pennsylvania thing again. Somebody at the beginning said that last week we looked at the Council of Censors in Pennsylvania. So he's coming back to that again to talk about that. The scheme of revising the Constitution in order to correct recent breaches of it, as well as for other purposes, has been actually tried in one of the states. One of the objects of the Council of Censors, which met in Pennsylvania in 1783 and 1784, was, as we have seen, to inquire whether the Constitution had been violated and whether the legislative and executive departments had encroached on each other. This important and novel experiment in politics merits, in several points of view, very particular attention. In some of them, it may, perhaps, as a single experiment, made under circumstances somewhat peculiar, be thought to be not absolutely conclusive, but, as applied to the case under consideration, it involves some facts which I venture to remark as a complete and satisfactory illustration of the reasoning which I have employed. Okay, yeah. Yeah, so, yeah, popular versions of history are always, going off of what TYZJ says, that's true of everything. Like, what I find when I study history is everything that I thought I knew about history is wrong. Everything. Every single thing ends up being wrong. Everything, my perception of the past as it existed when I was in college, basically. I learned some new things in college, but I took just a few classes about history in college. They kind of expanded what I knew about the past. They didn't really change or challenge anything about it, just I guess by the nature of the classes I was taking. But it was when I got into grad school. That's when I started like discovering there were all these things about the past that I had completely misunderstood or whatever. Oversimplifications of topics are necessity for people getting interested in them. Yep, getting people interested in them. I don't have any problem with it unless it's harmful to the general understanding of the topic. That's how I feel too. Yeah. Um, and sometimes people on my YouTube videos, they'll complain you're oversimplifying it. I'm like, yeah, duh. It's education. Like, well, you got to start somewhere. um, a nice thing about James Burke is that he doesn't simplify down to personality. Simplifies down. Yes, I agree. That's one of the great. Yeah, I totally agree that a lot of times popular versions of history focus on the personalities and like the great man theory type thing, and he really focuses on like social forces and technological, like how technology affects people's lives. So it's more of a social history side of things, which I think social history, a lot of people can connect with social history when they can't connect with the great man type history. People can't connect with like presidents and kings and battles, but if you talk about social history, people can connect with that. And that's what's great about James Burke's stuff, is that I think it would appeal to a lot of people that would not otherwise necessarily be interested in history or what they think history is based on how it's presented in high school. Yep, that's exactly right. The only way you won't be getting a simplified version of something is if you research it yourself. That's true, and that's actually the sad thing about doing history, is because you realize, or I've come to realize myself, the amount of time it takes to research a topic in order to get to a point where you don't have all those oversimplifications in your head. Like, it's impossible to learn all the stuff. So inevitably, even people who have a PhD in history, even people who've been teaching history for 20 years, 30 years in the classroom as a professor in college, they will have tons. I found this in my own personal like experience with people. I would encounter people who've been working as historians for decades, and they will have oversimplified versions of things, of historical topics that they don't personally work in, when it's just inevitable. And I'm sure I have the same thing. Like, I haven't delved deep enough in most historical topics to protect myself from making those same sorts of errors. It's just that I can detect it in someone else if I have done enough reading in that particular little topic. But it works vice versa too. It's funny because people don't consume about STEM YouTubers oversimplifying. They don't complain about STEM YouTubers oversimplifying topics, and it is absolutely the same thing. Oh, well, okay. Um, they will a little bit. Like, Veritasium did a video about electricity and got so much flack for it. Everybody was so angry at him because of how he oversimplified like how electricity works. And he was like, I'm just trying to teach the topic. Because electricity is like everything else in physics. Electricity is one of those things that is not intuitive, the way it works, compared to our, daily life. But yeah, I would agree. Overall, people don't complain as much. I think people don't have as much of a personal emotional stake in what a STEM YouTuber is going to say as often as they do for a history topic. Oftentimes with history topics, people have such an emotional attachment to a certain narrative of history, that it can rankle people more readily. TYZJ, this is why reading firsthand accounts is so interesting. Absolutely. I love reading firsthand accounts. It's so fun. Oh, yeah. Barbara Tuchman, right? That's how you say that. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I'm not a fan of Barbara Tuchman. The medieval Chinese text. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It is really awesome. As someone in STEM, 90% of the stuff isn't intuitive unless you have a strong background in the. Absolutely, yeah. I remember seeing that and finding it silly. Yep, yep. Um, Nothing in STEM makes sense. Like unless you've built up the background, like it just like it's not intuitive at all. Outside of that. It started a conversation that would eventually teach you a lot if you followed it all the way. Yep, yep. And you have to have a general perspective of anytime you're watching. It's not just a YouTube thing. People will sometimes say, "Oh, it's just because YouTube is oversimplifying and can't trust anything that's on YouTube." That's true, but that's also true of like everything else. It's true of intro classes in college. This actually happened to me when I was in high school. I was taught about atomic orbitals, and I don't remember which physicist it was that created that model, but it was like you have the nucleus and then you have the orbitals, like you have the orbital, the first orbital has can have up to 2 electrons, the next one up to 8 electrons, the next one up to 8. And the way I perceived it was that it was like nested spheres. And then I got to college and they're talking about all these weird shapes, like, and the orbitals are crossing each other and stuff, like in space. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. That contradicts what I was taught in high school. And it was a problem for me, like conceptually. But that's just the nature of education. You have to go through the oversimplification before you can get to where you're trying to get. I feel like Wikipedia is often railed against for being oversimplified, much more than other sources, because it's usually just offering raw information without any historical context to back it up. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of issues with how Wikipedia does things, or not administratively. I'm not talking about that, but like the way it'll present information. Sometimes it is that. Sometimes it's just a bunch of raw, especially for STEM stuff. Because I guess the kind of person who's writing STEM articles on Wikipedia is probably not the kind of person who's thinking about how to translate that for a non-science audience. But yeah, there are a number of issues with Wikipedia. I've actually gone to look at a lot of the Wikipedia articles for Federalist papers as I've gone along, and they're not actually that good, many of them. For World War I work is pretty solid. Yeah, I'm sure it is. Was it called Guns? What was it called? July, something about July. I don't remember what it's called. Yeah, she had a really famous book about 1914. Oh, the Bohr. Yeah, I think that's right. The Bohr model. That's the one I was talking about. Everything you learn about chemistry in high school is not real. Yeah, I know. It's a good model that describes most things. Yeah, that's right. I took a chemistry class. They gave us a really interesting shorthand for orbitals, but then in their process of explaining why the shorthand was accurate, I got totally lost in the details. Yeah. Oh, Hulagu Khan's Wikipedia article is really bad. I completely expect that. I would not be surprised one bit if Hulagu's articles a mess. All human intellectual endeavors are not real. They're just successively less wrong approximations. Yeah, I think that's probably. Oh, Guns of August. That's what it was called. Yeah, Guns of August. Yeah, that's really famous. I haven't read it, but I've never heard bad things about it. So, I'm sure it's fine. Okay. So at this point, so he's saying so he's bringing up Germs of September and Steel of October. Oh, no. One of these days, I'm gonna do a video about that book. Probably not soon, unfortunately, because of other stuff going on. But anyway, first of all, I have to sit down and anyway. I just totally forgot what we were doing. Okay, Council of Censors in Pennsylvania. So he brings up the Council of Censors in Pennsylvania, and that he's going to go through, and he has several reasons why it does. So the idea with the Council of Censors was that it would watch the other branches and make sure they stayed in line. And so he has he says, it involves some facts which I venture to remark as a complete and satisfactory illustration of the reasoning which I have employed, which is that it won't work. First, it appears from the names of the gentlemen who composed the council that some, at least, of its active and leading members had also been active and leading characters in the parties which preexisted in the state. Second, it appears that the same active and leading members of the council had been active and influential members of the legislative and executive branches within the period to be reviewed, and even patrons or opponents of the very measures to be thus brought to the test of the Constitution. 2 of the members had been vice presidents of the state, and several others members of the executive council within the 7. Oh, that's right, they had a 12-member executive council within the 7 preceding years. One of them had been speaker, and a number of others distinguished members of the legislative assembly within the same period. Third, every page of their proceedings witnesses the effect of all these circumstances in the temper of their deliberations. Throughout the continuance of the council, it was split into 2 fixed and violent parties. The fact is acknowledged and lamented by themselves. Had this not been the case, the face of their proceedings exhibit a proof equally satisfactory. In all questions, however unimportant in themselves or unconnected with each other, the same names stand invariably contrasted on the opposite columns. Every unbiased observer may infer without danger of mistake, and at the same time without meaning to reflect on either party, or any individuals of either party, that unfortunately passion, not reason, must have presided over their decisions. When men exercise their reason coolly and freely on a variety of distinct questions, they inevitably fall into different opinions on some of them. When they are governed by a common passion, their opinions, if they are so to be called, will be the same. Fourth, it is at least problematical whether the decisions of this body do not, in several instances, misconstrue the limits prescribed for the legislative and executive departments, instead of reducing and limiting them within their constitutional places. Fifth, I have never understood that the decisions of the Council on constitutional questions, whether rightly or erroneously formed, have had any effect in varying the practice founded on legislative constructions. It even appears, if I mistake not, that in one instance the contemporary legislature denied the constructions of the council and actually prevailed in the contest. This censorial body, therefore, proves at the same time by its researches the existence of the disease and by its example the inefficacy of the remedy. This conclusion cannot be invalidated by alleging that the state in which the experiment was made was at that crisis, and had been for a long time before, violently heated and distracted by the rage of party. Is it to be presumed that at any future septennial epoch the same state will be free from parties? Is it to be presumed that any other state at the same time or any other given period will be exempted from them? Such an event ought to be neither presumed nor desired, because an extinction of parties necessarily implies either an universal alarm for the public safety or an absolute extinction of liberty. Were the precaution taken of excluding from the assemblies elected by the people to revise the preceding administration of the government all persons who should have been concerned in the government within the given period, the difficulties would not be obviated. The important task would probably devolve on men who with inferior capacities would in other respects be little better qualified. Although they might not have been personally concerned in the administration, and therefore not immediately agents in the measures to be examined, they would probably have been involved in the parties connected with those measures and have been elected under their auspices. Publius. So he gives a whole range of reasons why Council of Censors wouldn't work. You have the same people involved in the Council of Censors. That's the first point. Same people, members of the Council of Censors that were members of other parts of the government. Second, that's the second one, isn't it? Active members had been active and leading characters in the parties which preexisted in the state. So first one is that you have party passions, you have factions, political factions in the state. The members of the council were members of those factions. They were members of other branches of the government. You can see in the third one, he talks about how you look at the alignment of how they voted on issues. They always voted reliably in certain partisan ways. So partisanship was a part of the Council of Censors. And then, fourth, they could misunderstand, or they could get things wrong themselves. Fifth, there's no rightly or wrongly have any effect in varying the practice found in legislative construction. So it's not like they could even enforce their decisions on the legislature. And then he's like, well, you might object by saying the factionalism was because of the heated political environment, the heated political moment in Pennsylvania at the time. But he says, what do you expect? Like, you expect that in the future you're not going to have that. There are going to be other issues. They're going to, like, factionalism is just a natural part of it. It's not like it is just a temporary thing. All right, so let's do number 51. And this one's also pretty short. For how famous it is, it's surprisingly short. To what expedient, then, shall we finally resort for maintaining in practice the necessary partition of power among the several departments as laid down in the Constitution? The only answer that can be given is that as all these exterior provisions are found to be inadequate, the defect must be supplied by so contriving the interior structure of the government as that its several constituent parts may, by their mutual relations, be the means of keeping each other in their proper places. Without presuming to undertake a full development of this important idea, I will hazard a few general observations, which may perhaps place it in a clearer light and enable us to form a more correct judgment of the principles and structure of the government planned by the convention. So he's saying, we've looked at all these ways that people would have something exterior to the government, exterior to the branches of government, to provide the checks and balances, and we've shown that none of them work. So now the solution must be found as something interior to the structure itself. In order to lay a due foundation for that separate and distinct exercise of the different powers of government, which to a certain extent is admitted on all hands to be essential to the preservation of liberty, it is evident that each department should have a will of its own, and consequently should be so constituted that the members of each should have as little agency as possible in the appointment of the members of the others. Were this principle rigorously adhered to, it would require that all the appointments for the supreme executive, legislative, and judiciary magistracies should be drawn from the same fountain of authority, the people, through channels having no communication whatever with one another. Perhaps such a plan of constructing the several departments would be less difficult in practice than it may in contemplation appear. Some difficulties, however, and some additional expense would attend the execution of it. Some deviations, therefore, from the principle must be admitted. In the constitution of the Judiciary Department in particular, it might be inexpedient to insist rigorously on the principle. First, because peculiar qualifications being essential in the members, primary consideration ought to be to select that mode of choice which best secures these qualifications. Secondly, because the permanent tenure by which the appointments are held in that department must soon destroy all sense of dependence on the authority conferring them. So he says that one might think that one would need to make sure that the members of each of the three branches of the government are selected separately from each other without any effect on each other, independently of each other, directly by the people. But he says that won't really work in practice, especially with the judicial branch. You would not want to have the members of the judicial branch elected directly by the people. And I think it's come up before on previous streams, like that's actually how it's done in some states, where the state Supreme Court is elected by the people. And that would be the logic behind that, would be to make the Supreme Court answerable directly to the people rather than answerable to the other branches of the government. Madison says that's a bad idea. First of all, because the qualifications you're looking for a Supreme Court justice are not necessarily kinds of qualifications that they would get elected on. You're looking for someone with particular qualifications. And then secondly, the permanent tenure by which the appointments are held in that department must soon destroy all sense of dependence on the authority conferring them. The fact that they serve for life, which is true for the federal Supreme Court, that's not true actually for all state Supreme Courts, but with regard to the federal Supreme Court, since the justices serve for life, it actually they're not actually that answerable to the voters anyway. Once they're elected, like, they don't have to worry about re-election. So it doesn't work on that level. All right, let me get caught up on chat. Maybe the U.S. should have a council of censors made up of Hollywood actors and Nobel Prize winners. Yeah, why not? Yeah, the actors would overtake it given their popularity. You should read from an earlier publishing. I want to see some long S's. Yeah, okay. I chose this edition specifically because it did not have the long S's. If there were long S's, it'd be harder for me to. I'd be pronouncing everything with an F. If equally evident that the member of each department would be F little, yeah, it would be a disaster. I couldn't do that. I think we should also elect doctors and make academic tenure dependent on plebiscites. Yeah, it's like, I think I've mentioned this before, but it's like when in Russia during the revolutionary period when they were electing their officers. Yeah. You guys have all kinds of ideas for constitutional reform. It is equally evident that the members of each department should be as little dependent as possible on those of the others for the emoluments annexed to their offices. In other words, for pay, were the executive magistrate or the judges not independent of the legislature in this particular, their independence in every other would be merely nominal. But the great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. The provision for defense must in this, as in all other cases, be made commensurate to the danger of attack. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man, that's a really famous line, by the way, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. This is one of the reasons that people say the U.S. system is so great, is that they baked into it an acknowledgement of human nature. People who are serving in federal government are probably going to be ambitious. So rather than trying to pretend that they're not going to be ambitious, instead use their ambition, use that as a means of countering each other to prevent anyone from gaining too much power. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may place meaning rank, constitutional rights of the office. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the office. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and, in the next place, oblige it to control itself. A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. So this is a bit elusive, what he's getting at here, but the way he says this last sentence, a dependence on people is no doubt the primary control on the government. That's a callback to the revolution. And, the idea of that if the government is becoming tyrannical or unjust, the people have a right to rebel against that government. That's the idea there. But then he follows that up with, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions, which I would take to mean that when you have revolutions, people get hurt. So if you can have some mechanism aside from revolution to prevent, as a preventative against the government or some branch of the government overstepping its place, that's a good thing. This policy of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives might be traced through the whole system of human affairs, private as well as public. We see it particularly displayed in all the subordinate distributions of power, where the constant aim is to divide and arrange the several offices in such a manner as that each may be a check on the other, that the private interest of every individual may be a sentinel over the public rights.
These inventions of prudence cannot be less requisite in the distribution of the supreme powers of the state. But it is not possible to give to each department an equal power of self-defense. In republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. The remedy for this inconveniency is to divide the legislature into different branches, and to render them by different modes of election and different principles of action as little connected with each other as the nature of their common functions and their common dependence on the society will admit. It may even be necessary to guard against dangerous encroachments by still further precautions. As the weight of the legislative authority requires that it should be thus divided, the weakness of the executive may require, on the other hand, that it should be fortified. An absolute negative on the legislature appears at first view to be the natural defense with which the executive magistrate should be armed, but perhaps it would be neither altogether safe nor alone sufficient. On ordinary occasions it might not be exerted with the requisite firmness, and on extraordinary occasions it might be perfidiously abused. May not this defect of an absolute negative be supplied by some qualified connection between this weaker department and the weaker branch of the stronger department, by which the latter may be led to support the constitutional rights of the former without being too much detached from the rights of its own department? So in this paragraph, he alludes to some of the provisions in the Constitution for how the things would work and how things are set up. And then he's using them as examples of how this accomplishes the goal of balancing the branches of government. So he says that the legislature is naturally going to be the most powerful branch in a republic, and therefore you want to dilute the power of the executive branch or the legislative branch and make it harder for it to consolidate power. And the way you do that is by splitting it into two houses. And then he brings up the fact that the executive branch is headed by a single person, president. And he says, look, well, that's how it should be, because the executive branch is naturally much weaker than the legislative branch. So having one person there helps to balance out that weakness by having a more decisive leadership. And then he mentions the veto power. When he says absolute negative on the legislature, he's referring to the presidential veto. And he says an absolute veto, like a veto that cannot be overridden, would go too far. That's what he says here at the last part of this paragraph. So he says, might this defect of an absolute negative be supplied by, in other words, might this problem of having an absolute negative, an absolute veto, could that be rectified by having some qualified connection between the executive branch and the Senate, the weaker branch of the stronger department? You have to kind of translate his phrases into the actual institutions he's talking about. Having some connection between the presidency and the Senate, by which the Senate may be led to support the constitutional rights of the president without being too much detached from the rights of the legislative branch. I think he's referring there to the vice presidency. Given how often the two houses of Congress fight, even when controlled by the same party, Madison may have a good point here. Yep. What if Madison knew people are now talking about how U.S. already surpassed British Empire and Roman Empire, but still remains a liberal democracy? I think he's gonna. Yeah, I think you're right. I think he would feel very proud, and also you would be gratified. I mean, they're saying in the Federalist Papers how this system's gonna work on a large, like you're gonna have a large scale democratic republic, and a lot of people said that's not possible, and then Hamilton and Jay and Madison are saying, actually, it is possible. It will actually work. But yeah, I think they still would be surprised and pleased if they saw that actually did work. 230 years later, we still have it. On the topic of the Founding Fathers' visions of the future, were people like Jefferson, who was in favor of an agrarian economic model, simply not recognizing trends in industrialization? I think I don't know. I mean, I don't know about Jefferson. I don't know if he thought that it was going to go in that direction. Of course, it was hard to tell at that point that that's what was going to happen. I mean, there was some like industrialization was happening in places like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, stuff like that. Things were happening, but I don't know how visible that was or how much of a sense of forward momentum there was like at the time. So I believe it would have been easy for someone in the 1780s to imagine that the U.S. would continue to be a primarily agrarian country. The big conflict, as I understand it, between the Jeffersonians and people who Jefferson disagreed with, was between agrarianism and commerce and like finance, the world of finance, like farmers versus finance, rather than necessarily industrialization. Although, and to be fair to Jefferson, he did not exclude any kind of commercial aspect to the U.S. He just, yeah, but yeah, I guess I don't know. I don't know how much he would have anticipated how things. I mean, the way he would talk about the future of the U.S., he certainly didn't envision it being industrial. So, yeah. At Congress, they had some messianic pretensions. They definitely did. Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to see the bigger picture in the eye of the storm. Absolutely. It was only in retrospect that people really saw how. Later on, like in the course of the 19th century, once people got used to seeing inventions happening so quickly, which became so common, especially in the latter half of the 19th century, but also, or before that too, but like the latter half of the 19th century was when it was like constant stuff was happening constantly, new inventions all the time, that affected people's daily lives all the time. So people of those generations, people who were growing up during that period or living during that period, they came to assume that this is the new normal. This is how things always are. That you have new inventions every few years. People's way of life changes dramatically from one generation to the next. And of course, that just continued on through the 20th century. And that's become the new normal. That's how people today think, that's how it is. So if that kind of thing were to slow down, there would have to be another shift in how people thought. That's of course that's also when you start seeing science fiction occur in literature. Is that second half of the 19th century? Is that whole idea of rapid progress that opens up the possibility of thinking of the future as being radically different technologically from the present. Yeah, I think Jefferson was just born too early to have that kind of perspective. Yeah, 1788 is a tough time to be predicting how technological changes to the means of production would affect politics. Yep. 2024 is a tough time to be predicting how technological changes to the means of production would affect politics. Yeah, it's always hard. Yeah. Yeah, John Adams' view about Hindu texts or Franklin's view about Confucian texts. Yeah. They had a lot less information than we have about stuff like that. But yeah, it would be interesting having more access to the information if they would have had different views. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, right here. This is where we are. If the principles on which these observations are founded be just, as I persuade myself they are, and they be applied as a criterion to the several state constitutions and to the federal constitution, it will be found that if the latter does not perfectly correspond with them, the former are infinitely less able to bear such a test. The principles of maintaining the equilibrium of the branches of government. He says the state governments are less able to do that than the federal constitution would. There are, moreover, two considerations particularly applicable to the federal system of America, which place it in a very interesting point of view. First, in a single republic, all the power surrendered by the people is submitted to the administration of a single government, and the usurpations are guarded against by a division of the government into distinct and separate departments. In the compound Republic of America, the power surrendered by the people is first divided between two distinct governments, and then the portion allotted to each subdivided among distinct and separate departments. Hence, a double security arises to the rights of the people. The different governments will control each other at the same time that each will be controlled by itself. So he's referring to the federalism and the division between U.S. Federal government and state governments. So he's saying, you have splits within splits. You're splitting up government power between two entirely different levels of federalism, federal and state, and then within each of those governments, there are different branches of government that have checks and balances on each other. And in the federal government, the legislative branch is split between two houses, and that's also the case in most state governments. That was the case in most state governments at the time. That continues to be the case with most of the states today. So you have checks within checks within checks. Checkception, checks and balanceception. Second, it is of great importance in a republic not only to guard the society against the oppression of its rulers, but to guard one part of the society against the injustice of the other part. Different interests necessarily exist in different classes of citizens. If a majority be united by a common interest, the rights of the minority will be insecure. There are but two methods of providing against this evil. The one, by creating a will in the community independent of the majority, that is, of the society itself. The other, by comprehending in the society so many separate descriptions of citizens as will render an unjust combination of a majority of the whole very improbable, if not impracticable. The first method prevails in all governments possessing an hereditary or self-appointed authority. This, at best, is but a precarious security because of power. And so let me recap. There's a long paragraph. So let me recap where we are so far. So he says the second, characteristic of the America's federal system, in addition to having the federal, you have federal government and state government. The other thing is, you need to have. It says the majority is always going to be inclined to take advantage of and trample on the rights of the minority. And so there's only two ways to deal with that problem. One is to have some external factor that, something external to the political system, provide a check against that, something the majority can't affect. The other is to have something internal to the nature of the majority itself. And in the case of the external thing, that's what you have in monarchy, in constitutional monarchies. You have the majority faction in the legislature that could theoretically trample on the rights of the minority, but then you have a monarch sitting apart from that. This is the idea of a constitutional monarchy: is you have a monarch who sits above politics, who's apolitical, and then he can step in to protect the minority when necessary. And he says the problem with that is that it's a precarious security because a power independent of the society may as well espouse the unjust views of the major as the rightful interests of the minor party and may possibly be turned against both parties. So he says it's not guaranteed that having an apolitical monarch that sets separate from the factions of the society as reflected in the government, there's no guarantee that that monarch will always look out for the interests of the minority party. It might actually take the side of the majority party. And then the second method will be exemplified in the second method of doing it is to have it within the nature of the majority itself. Have the majority so divided within itself that it can never unify. So he says the second method will be exemplified in the Federal Republic of the United States. Whilst all authority in it will be derived from and dependent on the society itself will be broken into so many parts, interests, and classes of citizens that the rights of individuals or of the minority will be in little danger from interested combinations of the majority. In a free government, the security for civil rights must be the same as that for religious rights. It consists in the one case in the multiplicity of interests, and in the other in the multiplicity of sects. The degree of security in both cases will depend on the number of interests and sects, and this may be presumed to depend on the extent of country and number of people comprehended under the same government. The extent of country and the number of people comprehended under the same government. This view of the subject must particularly recommend a proper federal system to all the sincere and considerate friends of republican government, since it shows that in exact proportion as the territory of the Union may be formed into more circumscribed confederacies or states, oppressive combinations of majority will be facilitated. The best security under the Republican form for the rights of every class of citizens will be diminished, and consequently, the stability and independence of some member of the government, the only other security, must be proportionably increased. Okay, so let me back up a second. So he brings up, so he says in the U.S., on the federal level, there's going to be so many different groups of different people, different groups. There's not going to be any unity. It'll be impossible for any minority group to be oppressed because no other, like, you won't be able to get a group of groups, a coalition of groups together that would band together as a majority to take away rights from a minority group. And nowadays, in modern American life, when we say the word minority, usually we're referring to identity minorities, racial minorities, sexual minorities, often gender. Like women are often classed as a minority. But this is not necessarily referring to that. I mean, it includes that, but it also includes a larger thing, like any group of people, any identifiable community of people, would be classed as a minority group. I mean, it would include a political minority, like a political group that's a small, or a political, political interest group, for example. And then he makes an analogy with religious groups, because he says, in a free government, the security for civil rights must be the same as that for religious rights. In other words, you maintain complete freedom for anybody to have any religion. You have lots of different religious groups operating in the country, and then not any single one religious group can therefore take control of the government and force its beliefs on all the other religious groups, or force them into a subordinate position or whatever. So he says it will work the same with civil rights. No one group of citizens can take away the civil rights of another group of citizens in the same idea. Religious minorities would be another example. So, like Quakers, for example, in the context of the U.S., 18th century U.S. Let me get caught up here. The role of the vice president as president of the Senate seems kind of weak as a mechanism to align the interests of the Senate with the executive branch. Yeah, I kind of agree. Especially the way it is now, because the vice president hardly ever is actually there. Maybe it was different in the beginning because, vice president actually did play, but that was pretty much the vice president's only job, was to go to the Senate meetings. So should we be initiating antitrust actions against overly large religious denominations? Yeah, there are certain states where certain religious groups have a lot of influence. So Madison essentially idealized a bureaucratic machine that would be so inefficient that it could never infringe on alien. Yep. Yeah, you could put it that way. Yeah. All right. A society with sufficiently many dimensions of civic interests that no attempted tyranny of the majority could ever hold together for long enough to do damage. Exactly. One thing I don't think he's really acknowledged, or he's not anticipating at this point, the formation of political parties, which kind of streamlines that whole process and makes it more efficient, when Jefferson specifically rejected adding Jesus to his religious liberty law, he mentioned that it's because this law is for all Christians, or even, yeah, he did, that's right. Jefferson wanted, equality for all religious groups, even if they're not Christians. Yeah. Not all people, not all of his contemporaries felt that way, but that was how he envisioned it. Political parties came into being and changed some of the. Yep, absolutely. I mean, I was thinking about this. I don't remember now. Where was it? Yeah, society itself will be broken into so many parts, interests, and classes of citizens that the rights of individuals or the minority will be in little danger from interested combinations of the majority. Yeah, that's not how it works now. We've had plenty of examples of interested combinations, or forming a coalition in one of the political parties and then taking away the rights of other people. Yeah, a great video topic. Maybe, yeah. I guess the nice thing about doing something that people can immediately connect with present day politics is that it will drive up engagement on the video. That's the glass half full version of you'll get a lot of hateful comments on a video like that. Parliamentary democracy enforces party discipline much more efficiently than a separated elected presidency, so even if a party takes power, internal dissent can still impede it. Yep, that's true. Yeah, the parliamentary democracies seem much more like party-level, like temporary dictatorships, almost. That's a very strong way of putting it. Okay. So I stopped in the middle. I say, this view of the subject must particularly recommend a proper federal system to all the sincere and considerate friends of Republican government, since it shows that in exact proportion as the territory of the Union may be formed into more circumscribed confederacies or states, oppressive combinations of a majority will be facilitated. So as you get smaller, if you drop down to confederacy level, like people are talking about having 2 or 3, instead of one big country, you'd have 2 or 3 different countries, one for New England, one for the South, kind of thing. Or if you get down to states on the state level, oppressive combinations of a majority will be facilitated. It'll be easier for these oppressive combinations of the majority to happen. The best security under the Republican form for the rights of every class of citizens will be diminished, and consequently the stability and independence of some member of the government. The only other security must be proportionally increased. Justice is the end of government. In other words, it's the purpose of government. Justice is the purpose of the government. It is the purpose of civil society. It ever has been and ever will be pursued until it be obtained, or until liberty be lost in the pursuit. In a society under the forms of which the stronger faction can readily unite and oppress the weaker, anarchy may as truly be said to reign as in a state of nature, where the weaker individual is not secured against the violence of the stronger. And as in the latter state, even the stronger individuals are prompted by the uncertainty of their condition to submit to a government which may protect the weak as well as themselves. So in the former state, will the more powerful factions be gradually induced by a like motive to wish for a government which will protect all parties, the weaker as well as the more powerful. It can be little doubted that if the state of Rhode Island was separated from the Confederacy and left to itself, the insecurity of rights under the popular form of government within such narrow limits would be displayed by such reiterated oppressions of factious majorities that some power altogether independent of the people would soon be called for by the voice of the very factions whose misrule had proved the necessity of it. In the extended Republic of the United States, and among the great variety of interests, parties, and sects which it embraces, a coalition of a majority of the whole society could seldom take place upon any other principles than those of justice and the general good. Whilst there being thus less danger to a minor from the will of the majority of the major party, there must be less pretext also to provide for the security of the former by introducing into the government a will not dependent on the latter, or in other words, a will independent of the society itself. It is no less certain than it is important, notwithstanding the contrary opinions which have been entertained, that the larger the society, provided it lie within a practicable sphere, the more duly capable it will be of self-government. And happily for the Republican cause, the practicable sphere may be carried to a very great extent by a judicious modification and mixture of the federal principle. So at the very end there, he's returning to the old theme from early on in the Federalist Papers of how, contrary to the idea that the large territory and population of the U.S. would actually make it harder for it to be a republic, the argument that Publius is making, all 3 of them, is that actually it will be easier. It actually will make the democracy more stable and more reliably just than it would be if it were smaller. And he makes earlier on, like up around this area, he basically connects anarchy with dictatorship. He kind of says those go in hand. Once you get to an anarchic state, everyone's ready for a dictator. Even the more stronger members of the society or stronger members of stronger factions or whatever, they will also welcome a dictatorship. So you're going to veer one direction or the other, you're always going to veer toward tyranny anyway. Edward Gibbon actually noticed Mongol religious policy, and it is a good thing. Yeah, the Mongol Empire is famous for having had religious tolerance. Right. Why is he picking on Rhode Island? So this is 1788. Yeah, there were several states that were talking about not ratifying. Of course, Rhode Island later on became the holdout, but at this point, I think he's using Rhode Island as an example as a small, as just being so small. I don't think it was the smallest population. I think that was still Delaware. But yeah, just the fact that it was really small. And of course, Delaware had already ratified. He can't use Delaware as an example because Delaware had already ratified the Constitution. As you know, if you know anything about Delaware, because they put it on their license plate, they put it on their state flag. It's their claim to fame is they were the first ones to ratify the Constitution. They had already ratified by the time he's publishing this. But I think he can't use Delaware as an example as a small state. So I think he's going to Rhode Island. That democracy. His claim here is that a democracy as small as Rhode Island inevitably will slump toward dictatorship just by the nature of you have this tiny population with nothing preventing the majority from lording it over the minority, which is going to lead to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And wasn't Rhode Island the exemplar of religious tolerance? It was one of them, yeah. It was founded by people who were kicked out. Is that right? Kicked out of Massachusetts Bay for religious reasons. That is the only fact about Delaware. Okay, there is one other fact about Delaware. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Wayne's World, but if you watch Wayne's World, you will learn one other fact about Delaware. Tyranny of the majority is on full display in New England town meetings. Yeah, that's it. That's what happens with direct democracy. Okay, yeah. So we are at the end of 51. So that's all I was going to cover tonight. Up to 51. So at this point, we're finished. That's the end of the section on Madison would have loved HOAs. We're at the end of the section on what's it called? Separation of powers and checks and balances. Now we're embarking on a new section, which I'll start the next stream, the next Federalist paper stream. We'll start with 52. We're getting into the nuts and bolts of the Constitution now, where he's going to start with Article 1 of the Constitution. We'll talk about the House of Representatives, and he's going to go through and we're going to look at it. There's an extended discussion in the Federalist Papers about the House of Representatives. It goes like, I don't know, like 7 or 8 essays or something just about the House of Representatives before he even gets to the Senate. Yeah, so that's where we are.